Imagine pointing a satellite at some of the oldest mosques in the world.
Right.
Based on everything we know about the standard history of Islam, you'd expect all of their foundational walls to align perfectly toward Mecca.
Right. I mean, that's the baseline assumption for anyone looking at this period.
Yeah, but then the data comes back and you discover that the earliest ones aren't pointing at Mecca at all.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they are pointing hundreds of miles away to a ruined ancient city in the deserts of Jordan.
Petra.
Exactly, Petra. So today we are looking at a really fascinating academic essay by Mark Bates. It's titled The Petra Genesis and the Revisionist Revision of Islamic Origins.
Well, that's quite a title.
It is, yeah. And we're going to use this deep dive to unpack how modern historical critical scholars are using physical evidence, specifically early mosque archaeology and ancient parchment manuscripts, to test the standard Islamic narrative of how the religion actually began.
Yeah, and just to set the baseline for this discussion, the standard Islamic narrative, or the SIN, refers to the traditional historical account.
Right.
It maintains that the religion emerged fully formed in the isolated desert valley of Mecca between 610 and 632 CE.
Okay.
And it also holds that the Quran was perfectly preserved, standardized, and then distributed by the Caliph Uthman around 652 CE.
Right, so like a single unalterable text.
Exactly. The belief is that this exact text has been passed down identically ever since.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the core tension we are exploring today is what happens when the 7th century archaeological and manuscript evidence doesn't quite match the literary histories that were written, a century or two later.
Right, because those histories were written much later.
Yeah, and we are looking at a historical landscape that is just incredibly complex when you actually start digging in the dirt or, say, putting ancient parchment under ultraviolet light.
Definitely. And before we dive into the data, we should probably clearly state our role here.
Yes, absolutely.
We are acting as guides to report on a very robust, ongoing academic debate. We aren't here to take theological sides or, endorse one viewpoint or attack anyone's religious tradition.
All right, we're just looking at the research.
Exactly. We are simply conveying the data, the historical questions, and the arguments presented in this specific source material to understand how historians weigh physical evidence against traditional narratives.
Perfect. So we are following the clues, and the first major clue in this essay brings us to the physical footprint on the ground.
The architecture.
Right, specifically the Qibla, the direction of prayer. Now, according to traditional accounts, the Qibla was permanently fixed toward the Kaaba in Mecca in the year 624 CE.
While the Prophet was residing in Medina.
Right. So the logical expectation for an archaeologist today would be that, every single mosque built after 624 should have its foundational orientation facing Mecca.
That is the architectural expectation, yeah. But the essay introduces the work of a researcher named Dan Gibson.
Oh, this is the satellite guy, right?
Yeah. Gibson decided to test this using modern technology. He compiled this massive database using satellite imagery and GPS coordinates.
To measure the mosques.
To precisely measure the orientations of mosques built in the 1st century of the Arab conquests, so the 7th and 8th centuries.
And the data set he produced just fundamentally challenges the established timeline.
It really does.
When you look at his measurements, the earliest recorded structures do not align with Mecca. They consistently converge on the ancient Nabatean city of Petra in modern-day Jordan.
Which is pretty shocking.
Right. And we are talking about structures built across a vast geographical expanse. It's not just one region.
No, it's everywhere.
You have the Great Mosque of Guangzhou in China.
Wait, China?
Yeah, China, which traditional sources date to around 630 CE.
Wow.
You have the original ground plan of the Fustat Mosque in Egypt, which was built by the conquering Arab armies around 641.
Okay, so Egypt, China.
And you even have the early foundations of the Al-Aqsa complex in Jerusalem, built between 691 and 709 CE. Gibson's data shows the lines from all these disparate locations crossing over Petra, not the Hijaz region where Mecca is located.
Yeah, and his research maps out a really distinct timeline. The very first clear, undisputed Meccan orientation in his data set doesn't appear until the Banpur Mosque in modern-day Pakistan.
And what year is that one?
That dates to roughly 727 CE.
727. So that is an entire century after the Qibla was supposedly finalized?
Exactly. And following that, Gibson identifies a deeply fractured transition period spanning from roughly 725 to 822 CE.
So almost another 100 years.
Right. During the century-long window, the architectural record is completely split. Some mosques are built facing Petra, newer ones begin facing Mecca, and some face intermediate or parallel axes that point to, well, neither.
Okay, I have to push back on Gibson's premise here, though.
Sure.
Judging 7th century builders by the standards of modern satellite GPS feels a bit like criticizing ancient sailors for not using Google Maps.
That's a fair point.
Like these early Arab armies and builders, they were expanding across thousands of miles of uncharted desert and unfamiliar continents. Did they actually possess the advanced, I don't know, spherical trigonometry required to calculate a precise great circle route to target a specific city in Jordan?
What's fascinating here is that you've just articulated the primary critique raised by leading historians of Islamic astronomy.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The essay highlights the counterargument from David A. King, who is a major authority on how historical qiblas were actually calculated.
Okay, so what does King say?
King argues that Gibson's entire methodology is fundamentally anachronistic. He points out that Gibson is taking highly precise geodesic azimuths.
Basically lines drawn perfectly across a digital globe.
Exactly, and he's projecting them onto an era long before those complex mathematical formulas were known to these builders.
Right, so if they didn't have the math to draw a straight line over the curvature of the Earth, how were they deciding which way to orient a massive stone building?
Well, they relied on what King defines as folk astronomy.
Folk astronomy.
Yeah, it was practical observational science. They looked at the natural environment around them. They used horizon phenomena like solstitial risings.
Meaning like where the sun comes up?
Exactly, marking exactly where the sun crests the horizon on the longest or shortest day of the year.
Oh, okay.
They used approximate cardinal directions based on prevailing seasonal winds or, traditional local star charts.
So it's very localized.
Very localized. When they built a mosque in Egypt or Syria, they were not attempting a mathematically perfect alignment to a distant coordinate. They were just using local, practical methods to face a general symbolic direction.
Okay, so King is essentially arguing that while Gibson is measuring exact degrees of deviation, the original architects were just aiming for south or east based on where the sun was rising that month.
Pretty much.
So assuming they were intentionally and mathematically targeting a secret sanctuary in Petra it's a massive leap of logic.
Yeah, King suggests the apparent convergence on Petra in Gibson's data is largely a methodological artifact.
A coincidence.
Right. The earliest mosques might be facing a general cardinal direction for localized astronomical reasons, not because Petra was an intentional, secret religious capital. The alignment we see from space today is a coincidence born from projecting modern precision backward in time.
This leaves us in a really interesting position. We have to hold two competing realities in tension here.
Yeah, it's tricky.
On one side, the empirical clustering that Gibson recorded in those early decades, that is a real phenomenon that needs a better explanation than just saying the builders were incompetent.
Right. The data is still there.
Yeah, the data poses a legitimate challenge to the simple, uncomplicated reading of the traditional timeline.
Absolutely.
But on the other side, King's critique is kind of devastating, attributing that clustering to a hidden petrogenesis remains a highly contested speculative hypothesis rather than, a settled academic consensus.
I agree. The stones present an anomaly, but they don't provide a definitive confession.
Let's follow the essay's line of inquiry anyway.
Okay, sure.
Let's say, purely for the sake of exploring the revisionist argument, that there actually was a northern focus in the very early days of the movement. Let's say the political or religious center of gravity was located in the Levant or around Petra.
Okay, hypothetically.
The obvious question is, why on earth would it shift hundreds of miles south to a harsh, isolated desert valley like Mecca?
Well, the answer to that requires looking at the chaotic, bloody reality of early empire building.
Always comes down to politics, right?
It really does.
Yeah.
The essay directs our attention to a critical political pivot that takes place in the late 680s CE under the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik.
The late 680s.
Yes. This is a period historians call the Marwanid Consolidation.
Because Abd al-Malik was in an incredibly precarious position at this time.
Very precarious.
He's trying to hold together a massive, sprawling empire that stretches from North Africa to Persia, but he's fighting a brutal, multi-front civil war known as the Second Fitna.
Right, the empire's tearing itself apart.
And one of his primary rivals, a man named Abd Allah ibn al-Zubayr, actually rebels and seizes control of the Hijaz, taking the traditional power centers, including Mecca.
Yeah, so Abd al-Malik essentially loses his grip on the religious heartland of the empire.
That political exile, it forces his hand, right?
It does. But his problems were much deeper than just a rival caliph. Abd al-Malik is ruling over an empire heavily populated by established literate Jewish and Christian communities, the dhimmis.
Right.
These are people with centuries of administrative experience, deep theological traditions, and complex imperial bureaucracies inherited from the Romans and Persians.
So he's got a lot of highly educated subjects who aren't in his religion.
Exactly. And he's also dealing with the Mawali, the non-Arab converts to the movement, who are treated as second-class citizens by the ruling Arab elite.
Okay, so it's a very fractured society.
Very. These subjugated populations largely view their Arab conquerors as relative newcomers, politically unstable and theologically unformed.
So Abd al-Malik realizes he can't rule a massive, diverse empire with sheer military force alone. He needs a distinct, centralized identity.
He needs a brand.
Yes. He initiates what we would today call a massive state-sponsored branding campaign to solidify his political legitimacy.
Right.
Because when you look at the physical evidence from his reign, you see a sudden, deliberate shift. Prior to about 691 CE, state documents, public inscriptions, and administrative records rarely use the terms Muhammad, Muslim, or Islam in the codified, standardized way we understand them today.
The wild to think about.
It is. The early Arab rulers were literally using older Byzantine or Sassanid templates for their bureaucracy, sometimes even keeping crosses or Zoroastrian fire altars on their initial coin.
Yeah, they just copied what worked. But then, in 691 and 692, Abd al-Malik completely overhauls the imperial image.
He changes the money.
He abolishes the old currency and introduces an entirely new aniconic script-only coinage.
No more pictures.
Right, he removes the pictures of Byzantine emperors and replaces them entirely with Arabic text declaring the Shahada.
The strict declaration of monotheistic faith.
Exactly, and explicitly naming Muhammad as the messenger of God.
Yeah.
It is a brilliant administrative move to push his specific religious narrative into the pocket of every single merchant and citizen in the empire.
And this is the exact same time he builds the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, which is just a masterclass in political architecture.
Oh, totally. The Dome of the Rock is perhaps the most crucial piece of physical evidence from this era.
Yeah, it dominates the skyline.
It dominates the skyline of a city sacred to both Jews and Christians. But more importantly, its inner mosaics feature the earliest extensive public display of Quranic material ever discovered.
And the content of those inscriptions is incredibly telling.
It really is. They aren't just generic prayers. They are heavily focused anti-Trinitarian polemics, directly targeting the theological beliefs of his Byzantine Christian subjects.
Right, like they declare phrases like, "Far be it from Allah that he should have a son and say not three cease."
It is a massive architectural assertion of an independent Arab monotheism planted right in the heart of the conquered territory.
So when we piece together the transition in early mosque orientations, the fact that Abd al-Malik temporarily lost the southern holy sites during a civil war, and his sudden introduction of standardized imperial religious terminology.
It paints a picture of a rapidly evolving tradition.
Right.
It suggests we are not looking at a religion that emerged fully formed in a vacuum, but rather a gradual process of administrative and religious consolidation.
Which makes sense for an empire.
Exactly. The political center of gravity was shifting due to civil war, and the religious narrative was being systematically codified by the state to support a unified, distinct Arab empire.
And didn't something happen to Petra around this time too?
Yes. We must also consider the essay's mention of a catastrophic earthquake in the Levant in 713 CE.
Oh, right.
Which devastated the Petra region, and that would have further accelerated the decline of any northern infrastructure.
Okay, so we've established how the stone architecture and the political borders evolved. Now, I want to transition from the stone to the parchment.
The manuscripts.
Yeah, the essay moves into a paleographical analysis of the text itself. The standard Islamic narrative insists that a perfectly preserved, singular text has existed without a single varying letter since the Caliph Uthman distributed his master copies to the major cities in 652 CE.
Right, that's the tradition.
But when historical critical scholars actually look for these master copies, the physical evidence tells a very different story.
The physical reality is that no complete 7th century manuscript matching that precise description exists in the current archaeological record.
None at all.
No. The most famous early copies that are often cited as original Uthmanic codices, like the Topkapi manuscript in Istanbul or the Samarkand Codex in Tashkent.
People point to those a lot.
They do, but they have been rigorously analyzed by modern paleographers. The analysis reveals they actually date to the early to mid-8th century, decades after Uthman. Furthermore, they are incomplete, and when compared to the modern standard text, they contain numerous scribal errors, varying spellings, and clear evidence of later erasures and corrections.
Okay, and this brings us to the most fascinating piece of manuscript evidence discussed in the essay, the Sanaa Palimpsest.
Oh, this is a great story.
The story of its discovery alone is incredible. So in 1972, heavy rains caused the roof of the Great Mosque of Sanaa in Yemen to collapse.
Yeah.
When workers went up to repair the ancient loft, they found literal potato sacks stuffed full of old, decaying parchment hidden away between the ceiling and the roof. They had accidentally uncovered a manuscript graveyard.
Yeah, among those tens of thousands of fragments was the palimpsest. Now, for our listeners who aren't familiar with ancient scribal practices, parchment, which is made from animal skin, was incredibly labor-intensive and expensive to produce.
You couldn't just run to the store for a notebook.
Exactly. So if a scribe needed to copy a new text but lacked fresh materials, they would take an older manuscript, wash or scrape off the existing ink, and write the new text over the top of the cleaned page.
Recycling.
Yeah, that recycled document is called a palimpsest.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because to the naked eye, a palimpsest just looks like the newer upper text. But the old ink contains iron and acids that physically bite into the parchment. It leaves a chemical footprint.
Right.
Using modern technology, specifically ultraviolet light photography, scholars can actually read the erased lower text that is invisible under normal lighting. It is exactly like a forensic expert recovering a deleted digital file from a hard drive. You think you've emptied the trash bin, but the ghost data is still burned into the memory sectors.
It's amazing technology.
Yeah.
And radiocarbon dating places the parchment of the Sanaa Palimpsest firmly in the mid to late 7th century, making it one of the oldest surviving fragments in the world.
So it's right from that early period.
Yes. But when scholars like Behnam Sadeghi, Mohsen Goudarzi, and Asma Hilali analyzed the deleted lower text under UV light, they uncovered something that fundamentally challenged the concept of a single, immutable early text.
Because it didn't match.
Right. The hidden lower layer did not match the standard version we have today.
It contained a non-canonical sequence of surahs. The chapters were ordered completely differently, and within the verses they sampled, they documented over 70 distinct textual variants.
Yeah, quite a few.
And we aren't just talking about spelling differences, we are talking about variations in verbs, nouns, and prepositions.
Right. To give a concrete sense of what these variants look like, they might involve a missing conjunction like the word and, which slightly alters the rhythm of a verse.
Okay.
In other places, a specific noun might be replaced by a synonym, or a phrase might use the pronoun he instead of explicitly naming Allah.
Small changes, but definitely change.
Exactly. While these variants rarely upend core theological doctrines, they definitively prove a state of textual fluidity. The text was in flux.
I think it's important to clarify that discovering physical proof of a first draft or a regional variant doesn't necessarily mean someone maliciously corrupted the text.
No, not at all.
In fact, traditional Islamic scholarship has always documented that prominent early companions of the prophet figures like Ibn Masud or Ubay ibn Ka'b maintained their own personal codices.
Right, the companion codice.
And the historical literature openly admits that these companion codices had different chapter orders and slight wording variations, which is exactly why Uthman supposedly ordered them destroyed to unify the community.
Yeah, so the Sanaa Palimpsest isn't necessarily introducing a scandalous new narrative. It is providing the surviving archaeological proof of a phenomenon the tradition itself acknowledges.
It's physical proof.
Yes, it proves that early textual plurality was a physical reality on the ground. The path from those diverse regional companion codices to the single globally uniform text we see today was much more complex, messy, and protracted than the neat historical blueprints suggest.
That raises a crucial question, though. If there were multiple reading traditions floating around on these expensive pieces of parchment, how did the text evolve into the globally uniform, exact standard that millions of people memorize today?
Well, the essay explains that the answer lies in the actual mechanics of early Arabic writing, a concept known as Scriptio Defectiva.
Defective script.
Right. Early Arabic was a consonant-heavy skeleton. It was not a fully realized alphabet in the way we think of modern writing systems. Crucially, it lacked diacritical dots.
The little dots above and below the letters.
Exactly. In modern Arabic, you use dots above or below a letter to distinguish one consonant from another. But in the 7th century, they didn't write the dots.
Oh, wow.
So the single written skeletal shape could represent a B, a T, a TH, a Y, or an N, depending entirely on where you mentally placed the missing dots.
And it also entirely lacked short vowel marks. The text was essentially bare bones. It wasn't designed to be read cold by a stranger who had never heard the recitation.
As an aid memoir.
Right, a memory aid for someone who already knew the oral tradition. It's like looking at a custom license plate that says HLTH. If you know the driver, you know it stands for health.
Right.
But an outsider might read it as health or health. The skeleton is the same, but the lack of precise information forces the reader to supply the meaning.
That's a great analogy. Because of this inherent ambiguity in the script, multiple canonical writing traditions organically developed across the empire. These are known as the Qira'at.
The reading traditions.
Yes, and these were not merely differences in regional dialect or pronunciation. Because readers had to supply the missing dots and vowels to the skeletal text, it sometimes resulted in entirely different verbs, nouns, or grammatical senses for the exact same written passage.
So the lack of precise written data actually fostered a massive diversity of traditions. But what truly fascinated me was how this diverse web was finally flattened into the uniform text we know today.
The modern standard.
Yeah, the global uniformity we see right now is largely a product of 20th century technology and bureaucracy.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, in 1924, a committee in Cairo, Egypt, was tasked with creating an official, standardized print edition of the Quran for the Egyptian public school system.
They just needed a textbook.
Exactly. They needed a single, easily testable version for students. To achieve this, they had to make a definitive choice. They selected one specific reading tradition, the Hafs and Asim reading out of the dozens that historically existed.
Got it.
And they printed it with every single diacritical dot and short vowel mark permanently locked into place.
They froze the text. Once it hits the printing press, the fluidity ends. And because the Saudi government later adopted the specific 1924 Cairo edition and mass distributed it globally through their immense wealth, it became the default standard.
It became the version everyone knows.
Right. The modern printing press retroactively created the illusion of single, unalterable ancient orthography, completely masking the rich, complex diversity that we know existed in early manuscripts like the Sanaa Palimpsest.
It is a profound example of how technological shifts from defective handwritten script to the mass-produced printed page fundamentally shape our perception of history and religious transmission.
We've covered a massive amount of ground today. We explored the architectural anomalies of Dan Gibson's satellite data, showing early mosques pointing away from Mecca, and the nuanced critique of folk astronomy that pushes back against it.
We covered a lot of history.
We did. We traced the political consolidation under Abd al-Malik, who used architecture and coinage to centralize an empire. And we looked at the physical parchment of the Sanaa Palimpsest, which proves early textual diversity existed long before modern printing presses locked a single reading into place.
And engaging with this kind of historical critical investigation is vital. It reminds us that history is an organic, deeply human process. Texts, ideas, and cultures do not drop from the sky fully formed. They are transmitted by people navigating civil wars, shifting borders, and the limitations of their own writing systems.
So, what does this all mean? We've looked at the physical architecture in the dirt and the chemical traces on parchment. But there's another layer of evidence we need to touch on, and it as coded directly into the vocabulary of the text itself.
The environmental markers.
Exactly. The essay points out a striking contrast between the traditional setting of the religion and the geographic fingerprints found in the scripture. The Quran consistently references a very specific type of environment. It talks about agriculture featuring olive trees, clay loam, streams, and abundant grass. It describes the messenger passing by the ruined pillars of salt of the Dead Sea, morning and evening.
And these are distinct environmental markers. Olive trees require a Mediterranean climate to flourish. They did not grow naturally in the hyper-arid, isolated desert environment of 7th century Mecca.
Right.
Furthermore, the Dead Sea is located roughly 600 miles to the north of Mecca. A daily commute past its ruins would be geographically impossible for a merchant living in the Hijaz.
We've spent this entire deep dive looking at satellites, UV lights, and ancient coins, trying to find clues about early Islamic origins. But maybe the most compelling evidence doesn't require a microscope at all.
It's right in the text.
Yeah. Maybe the true geographic origins of the movement have been hiding in plain sight, written directly into the environmental backdrop of the text itself all along. Something to think about. Thanks for taking the deep dive with us today.